I am very thrilled to be introducing our plenary speakers this morning. When I first started my theory papers, this is my theory, was reading Dr. Wenger's book. But let me tell you about them. Etienne Wenger-Trayner is a globally recognized thought leader in the field of communities of practice, who was featured by Training Magazine in their A New Breed of Visionary series. A pioneer of the communities of practice research, he is the author and co-author of the seminal articles and books on the topic. As previously mentioned, he co-authored the book Situated Learning, which was the book that started me on this journey, and as well as Communities of Practice, Learning, Meaning, and Identity, where he lays out a theory of learning based on the concept of communities of practice. Cultivating Communities of Practice, a guide to managing knowledge, is addressed to the practitioners in the organization, and one that I can say our Professional Wellbeing Committee is using very closely. And Digital Habits, dealing with issues related to technology. His work as researcher, author, and consultant has influenced both thinking and practice in a wide variety of fields, including business, education, government, and social theory. Beverly Wenger-Trayner is a learning consultant specializing in communities of practice and social learning systems. Her expertise encompasses both the design of learning architectures and the facilitation of processes, activities, and use of new technologies. She has worked internationally with organizations such as the International Labor Organization, Nuclear Threat Initiative, the World Bank, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has substantial experience in coaching conveners and in supporting multilingual groups across cultures, time zones, and geographic locations. She has published chapters and articles about learning in internationally distributed communities and co-authored a popular toolkit on social reporting. She has also been the creative director of an open source platform for networked communities. On her website, she states, working with people in international settings and complex landscapes is where I feel most at home, especially when it includes the integration of new technologies and social media in innovative ways. Considering where our organization is today and where we hope to be in the future, we think that these speakers will be ideally placed to help us move into a new future for ACPE. And we assured them that you would be a highly engaged and authentic group. So I think they have a lot of work cut out for them, but we are thrilled to have them. Will you join me in welcoming them to the stage?
Hi. Well, actually, I think this cameraman is going to hate us and might have something to say because as you're not moving down, we're going to move up. So, hi. Does anybody here, by the way, think community of practice, never heard of it? Right? A few hands? All right, that's okay. That's okay, yeah. All right, just to get a sense. Okay, so we're going to talk with you. Please feel free to interrupt. We'll keep our eyes open for hands up. We've got some roving mics somewhere. Could we see the roving mics? Over here? Okay. So if you have a question while we're speaking, please just put your hand up and ask. We prefer it to be a little more interactive. We've heard ourselves speak a few times. Yeah. Okay, so here they are.
No, we'll do that.
Okay, I'll leave it here. Okay, so Etienne, do you want to start?
Yes, so can we have the slides up? Okay. So one way to introduce what we're doing is to do it almost like autobiographically, how we got into that and how we moved on from the early days. So this was in 1987 in an institute called Institute for Research on Learning, which was started to transform education. And the idea of this institute was to bring scholars together to rethink the concept of learning with the idea that if we look at learning in and of itself, not as the result of teaching, but learning in and of itself, we may get new ideas about how to develop schools and institutions of learning. That was the idea of the institute. And I was coming there, I had been doing work in artificial intelligence, but I was working with an anthropologist, and we decided to look at apprenticeship because she had studied apprenticeship in West Africa. And apprenticeship was interesting because it was an age-old mode of learning. It was mostly successful, so you don't have a curve grading, you know. And in fact, when you look at apprenticeship, there's very little teaching. There's a lot of stealing knowledge here and there, but very little teaching. And so we looked at apprenticeship in different contexts. And the first thing that we noticed is that when you look at apprenticeship as a practice, very little interaction is happening with the master. A lot of the interactions are happening among apprentices. If you have a young apprentice, you have a question, you don't go to the master, you go to another apprentice who is a little ahead of you. Okay? And so we needed a name for this kind of living curriculum that we observed in the world. And we call it a community of practice. That's how the concept was born, if you will, because we needed a name for that phenomenon that we saw in apprenticeship. And if you look at that slide, it suggests that learning is, in fact, a kind of journey into that community of practice. You start at the periphery. If you are a young tailor, you start by doing some errands, something that is useful to the community, that gives you legitimacy in that community, but something that's not difficult or dangerous. It doesn't cost the community if you make a mistake. And then you do certain things, like you start sewing a button, all the way to the time when you are asked to cut the fabric. At that time, by that activity, without a test, but by that activity, you are recognized as a full member. Because it's a very dangerous activity. If you make a mistake, it's very costly. And in order to cut the fabric the right way, you need to have seen what happens to that fabric to become a jacket. Because it's not obvious the shape of the fabric that has to become a jacket. Okay? So you can think now of learning as a kind of social journey into that community with moments that mark the fact that you are actually progressing and becoming a full member. So a number of things that are important to notice here. The first thing is meaning. Meaning is driving the learning. Yeah, that's what I was saying about the fabric, the shape of the fabric. The meaning is driving the learning, not the instructions, not the techniques. Now, there are techniques. You know, you learn to sew a button. But it's the meaning of the technique that is driving the learning of the technique. And mind you, if we think of our schools, for instance, often it's the opposite. Learn what I'm telling you to learn, and maybe you'll find meaning in it sometime later, you know, at age 35 when you need to do a division, and you use your iPhone instead of doing the long division algorithm. Now, I'm just kind of kidding, but I think it's important that relationship between meaning and learning. But meaning taking place in the context of specific social practices. These social practices being the property of a community. So learning in this context has whole the complexity of the social world. And the last thing being your identity, the transformation of the person. So you are not sewing a button, you are becoming a tailor. And this idea of learning as becoming, not simply learning as technicalities, was very central to the perspective on learning that came out of these early studies, that learning is an experience of being a human being. Learning is a development of a person, not simply an accumulation of facts and skills.
So here's an example, in a sense, of this happening. This is a group that I was working with in Eastern Africa. They are people from Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the newest country, South Sudan, at that time. Things were a bit more peaceful then. And in this community, South Sudan, now these are public accounts committees. They are members of committees, members of parliament, who oversee public spending by the government. And they hold government members to account for the spending. And in South Sudan, which had just recently, this is a community of practice that they have among these public accounts committees in those countries in Eastern Africa. And their newest member, South Sudan, of course, their public accounts committee had never held a public hearing. And it's hard holding a public hearing. You've got to bring the government ministers in front of you. You know, a lot of corruption may have happened or may not, but so what they did was the older members of the community organized a role play of a public hearing. So the South Sudanese Public Accounts Committee held the hearing, had to go through, it was a whole day process, right from putting their hands on the Bible right through to the end, go through the whole process with the other members of the community playing the role of rather rascally government ministers. So they played the government ministers and the public hearing took place. And at the end of the day, the older members then sat down the Public Accounts Committee of South Sudan and told them what they'd done right, but also all the things they'd missed and what they should have done. You should have brought in the police at this stage, or you had authority to say this, you should have said that. Okay? So there they were, giving their newest member practice in running a public hearing without actually having to do it. So in a sense, that is what we call stage one of the theory, acting out in practice in a community of practice, where those members like South Sudan, the members of the Public Accounts Committee, actually one of the hardest things for them was to identify with being a member of a Public Accounts Committee, not simply a member of Parliament, but someone who was responsible for overseeing public spending. And so this is the beginning of their journey, really, of identifying as a Public Accounts Committee member who held themselves accountable to other Public Accounts Committees in Eastern Africa rather than to their own government. So there's a sort of identity of becoming there of South Sudan Public Accounts Committee.
And so if you think of learning and supporting learning from that early perspective, what is really central is giving people access to authentic practice. Like, for instance, a colleague of mine is studying medical education from this perspective. And he says, becoming a doctor is really a transformation of your identity, of your person. And those moments where the interns are really feeling like they are learning are moments where they have a chance to really be involved in actual practice, okay? So, for instance, a student said, you know, I was part of a team and a patient died. And the whole process of being involved in the emotional dimension, in the after-action review that happened and so on and so forth, for her was like, she was not a doctor yet, but she felt like a doctor. And that was really an important moment in her trajectory to become a doctor, perhaps more significant than any class she had taken or any specific instruction she had received.
Now, the thing about that, which is what we call phase one, is that it's assuming that there is a competence and that people are going to find their way eventually into that competence. But what if the competence doesn't already exist? What if we don't know what it is? What if we have to learn what we don't know, what nobody knows? So here we start moving into phase 2 of the theory, and this was really my entry point into communities of practice. I was actually, in those days, I lived in Portugal. I worked at a business school, and I was very concerned with international communication for my students. I was teaching English for academic and specific purposes, and I quickly realized that my students weren't interested in English because they wanted to go and live in England or Australia or America. They were interested in English because they wanted to live in Portugal, and they wanted to work in international companies dealing with Chinese and people from other parts of the world. So why was I teaching them English? And what I decided to do was to follow a human resource director in Portugal. She was Anabela Fernandes, who's up there, who was a very successful international business person, awarded many prizes and headhunted. And she was perfect because actually her English wasn't great. So I followed her for about 3 months. In her meetings at lunchtimes, she let me read her emails. Emails were quite new in those days. And I was fascinated to see how much she used this sort of network of people that she'd built up over time, mostly from her previous company, which was another international company, and they'd all gone to work in other companies across Portugal. So there was this sort of group of international business people in Portugal who very much bounced ideas off each other. So, for example, entrepreneurialism came into the fore. This was in about 98, and it became sort of part of management discourse. And so headquarters said, right, Portugal, right, Anabela, you know, we want our managers to be entrepreneurial. Now, that's got to become part of their performance indicators. Portugal was under a dictatorship until about 74. This was about 25 years later. It wasn't even the word, nobody understood it. All the managers had been brought up at a time where taking the initiative was not encouraged, even punished. And she interacted a lot with this network of people to see what did entrepreneurialism in managers look like in Portugal. What were they doing in their factories? What did it look like? So she was translating that, and between them, they were developing an understanding of what entrepreneurialism in Portugal, in Portuguese factories looked like. And in 98 was when Etienne's book came out, and I read his book, Learning, Meaning and Identity, and I thought to myself, that's interesting. It looks like she's got a community of practice here. And I put that in my report to her for validation. It was among 5 other findings that I had, and I gave it to her to read. And when I came back a week later with a red pen, she had circled the bit on communities of practice, and she said, Beverly, that is why I'm successful. That is the key to my success. I have a community of practice. When she said that, something clicked, and I thought, this is important. And so you can see there, though, that that's different from phase 1. There, the competence of being an international manager in Portugal was a new and growing one. They were creating it, right? Nobody knew how to do it. There was no existing mastery for how to do it. They were creating it. So this was a community of practice, but it wasn't a journey into something that was known. It was people working together to create new knowledge. And so the picture there is slightly different. It's more like an arrow with people coming in and out. There was a sort of core group in the community of practice. She was fairly core, but there were other managers who sometimes came to some things and had different interactions. But they were growing a competence which was new.
And so here another example of a community that did this very intentionally. These are head of treasury in Southeastern Asia, brought together by the World Bank. They meet 4 times a year. And here, they are around the table, and they need to discuss how do you create a memorandum of understanding with the central bank. You don't have to worry about the details of it, but it's difficult, and it's culturally sensitive with issues of borrowing and so on and so forth. And so they are around the table, and there again, there's no master. There's a person from the bank who's kind of facilitating the process, who has some knowledge of, he has some knowledge of the domain, but he's not himself a head of treasury. And they are just discussing that. And at the end of this meeting, actually, they developed a set of general guidelines for how to go about interacting with the central bank. But it was a partnership, a learning partnership among people who all struggled with the same thing that allowed them to come up with a set of shared guidelines that they were then going to go implement in their countries and come back 3 months later and say, how did it go? Were the guidelines correct? No, maybe we should change this or that. Okay. So this is a process now that is very intentional. Note that it's a bit different from the communities that we were studying in the phase 1 of the theory that existed, they were naturally occurring. Here, this is a cultivated community by the World Bank who pays for these people to come together and provides a facilitator for the process. So it's a very cultivated process, but it is still a learning partnership based on people's interests and challenges and so on and so forth. So at that stage, communities of practice starting to be adopted as a way to support learning in all sorts of different contexts. And yeah, you can see the World Bank there, but you can see also.
Yeah, and for many of these companies, they'd actually invested, there'd been a phase during, I don't know how many people remember the information age and the knowledge age, right? So, but companies had invested a lot of money in building up big repositories with information. So if you wanted this information, you'd be able to get it. But of course, when somebody wanted a piece of information in a company, actually what happened was John would pick up the phone and say, hey, Amy, I know you've done this. You know, how did you do it? And so companies in a way were hungry for something that would move them away from simply gathering lots of information and documents.
And so for many of these organizations, you can see also the CDC here as a government organization, the government of Singapore. You can see UNICEF and the World Bank as development organizations. For many of these organizations today, it's part of the system that you belong to a team where you do your work, and you belong to a community of practice where you engage with other people who have a similar function, and you develop the practice of doing that together, because in your team, you may be the only person who is contributing a specific specialty. And so you have a place where you can talk with other people who are also contributing that and can understand what you're struggling with, can appreciate what you're struggling with, and help you with it in a way that maybe a member of your team cannot, because they don't really understand the details of your practice enough to help you with something that you're struggling with.
So this is actually an old diagram of Etienne's, but people find it very helpful, which is in a community of practice, again, unlike a team, in a team you want everybody to pull their weight. In a community of practice, what you tend to see is that there is a core group, people who are there, who are passionate to make something happen because it's going to benefit them. And outside that, you get people who are active, but not necessarily carrying the weight. You get people who occasionally join, and you get peripheral members. And that's
for lurkers on the web.
Lurkers on the web, yeah. Mm-hmm. But so you get different types of participation, and we work with many people who get very anxious that they have peripheral people or people who aren't pulling their weight. But that is very normal in a community of practice, because not for everybody, what you want in a community of practice is that it's extremely useful for you. You're driving it because it helps you in your practice when you go home. And for some people, it may be only a peripheral part of their practice. And so they don't necessarily want to put all the energy into keeping it going, but they're still very useful people because they are also learning. And in fact, if you ever do any research on your members, very often those peripheral members actually report some of the greatest learning.
And sometimes they take that learning into their main community, and they act as brokers between these communities, bringing learning across. Now, there are cases, and note how different that is from the diagram, the first diagram, because here, learning is not necessarily a trajectory inside. You may learn a lot by remaining peripheral, and that's okay. There are cases where you want to worry about that, you know. If everybody in headquarters is in the core group and people in the field are peripheral, that's something that may require an intervention. Or if all the men are in the core group and all the women on the periphery. If what determines where you are in the core group or in the periphery is determined by something else than your relationship to the practice, then maybe it requires an intervention.
Or if the core group is always the same people and the periphery is always the same people and there's never any movement across, you might also have a little bit of a flag to say, is something going wrong here?
So in this perspective on communities of practice, and they are not, it's not that we move from one to the other. You can, even in communities like this, you need to introduce your newcomers. But it's an additional dimension. Here, what really enables the learning of the community, what develops the learning capability of the community is these loops between practice and back. This idea that you get the guidelines from the meeting, you go back home, you try it out, and you come back, and you report on whether it worked or not. So this idea, it's almost like a little action research group where you really use the practice as a way to develop the competence.
Because we're used to, when we think of learning as it's done in schools and most training, we're used to thinking learning is receiving, and then what I do with that has got nothing to do with anything to do with the learning experience. But here, what you do with what you get from your interactions and the activities in your community, you go out and test them and you bring them back. And that is part of the learning process. It's not something separate that happens out there. It's part of the learning process.
And in a pure apprenticeship system, the purpose of a new apprentice is not so much to contest the competence of the master. It's to become one of those, to become like the master. In these communities, contesting is actually a very important part of how the community functions. It's very important to develop enough trust that if somebody says something and you go, in my practice, it doesn't look like that, you want to be able to express that. You want to be able to say, I appreciate what you said, but when I meet with a person and I try to do my job with them, doesn't work for me. So let's figure out why you have this idea and I have that idea. And so this idea of contestability as a friendly thing, not contestability as a conflict, but contestability as a way to engage together in trying to figure out something is central to how a community like this functions and the kind of trust that you need to develop for that to become productive rather than simply conflictual.
And that contestability is part of really negotiating what does it mean to be good in this. And so for Annabella in the companies, they were negotiating a lot of their interactions and their contesting and their discussions was what does it mean to be, how will we recognize who is a good international business person, the competence of international business. There's a hand over there, Etienne.
Yep. Where are you? Because people may not be able to hear you.
So in my practice of supervision, I think the quality of contestability is one of the first indicators of professional identity, of being invited or tipping your toe into the water of the profession or of the guild.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. But it's not always easy to create that, to create that feel among a group, that contesting what the group is thinking is actually a real contribution to the group and not like being a pain, you know?
So yes, so then my responsibility to respond to the contestability is part of my own skill as a supervisor to not react, to engage the student more about it, and to model that, and then to invite the peer group to do the same and to follow his or her example of being the contestor.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And often when we talk about trust in a community of practice, that's where the trust is. The trust is that as learning partners, I am able to contest and that is part of the process. So building trust is around this idea that it's all right to contest. Yeah.
And that it is expected that actually among the members of a committee of practice, one of the expectations is that if you see that I'm going to do something stupid, let me know, right? So that it's an expectation, and you know, like for instance, if you're drilling wells at Shell, you know, where you have a committee of practice around the world of drilling specialists, and you have a question, something like this, you put it on the website. There is an expectation that if you sit in somewhere around the world, in the Gulf of Mexico or something like this, and you see that someone in the North Sea is going to do something stupid, it would be a lack of membership not to say, hey, be careful, maybe for you it's going to work.
You've got your lav.
All right. Maybe it's going to work for you, but for us, you know, when we did that, the drill broke, you know. Yeah. So you can see that this is really a new set of expectation of collegiality, of helping each other be the best that you can be.
So we talk about three main elements of a community of practice. There's the domain, right? The domain, which is that thing that people identify with. It's like, what's the topic or what's the theme? But who am I in this? I identify with this as my domain. And the community is the people who care about that domain. So it's the people, it's the relationships of trust between them, the fact that they recognize each other as learning partners, and the practice, what is it that they do together? But those three things are really interlocked. If you change the domain, the community will change and the practices will change. If you introduce a new practice, right, it will allow new voices at the table, and it might change the domain. So the three things work together. And when you're in a community of practice, you have to pay equal attention to all three and the interconnection between them.
Because if learning is really a social process, then the voices you have at the table really make a difference. I was working with a community of practice on mental health in schools, and we were at a conference in Pennsylvania, and some of the question was, what is the relationship with learning disability and mental health? Those are two different professions, but they deal with the same kids, right? So that was really one of the questions that they were addressing. And some kids were there. In the conference, they were going to do a little show in the evening. And we were at a meeting that was like a side meeting from the conference. And suddenly the professionals were there. They were debating whether kids with learning disability should have the same curriculum as a general curriculum or have a separate curriculum. And there was these questions about integrating versus separating and so on and so forth. And somebody said, why don't we invite the kids to join our meeting? You know? And what was interesting is that just the change in membership completely changed the discourse. The big question of integrating curriculum or separating curriculum for the kids was completely irrelevant. For them, the big problem was stigma. You know, how can we make sure that having a learning disability doesn't become a stigma? So for them, separating curriculum was a question of like, does it create then a stigma? Not so much like, is it a good curriculum or not? So it was interesting to see that the composition of the community, and actually after that, they decided to have a standing committee of kids in the community as a practice group in their community, because they realized that integrating the voice of the kids themselves was so central to having a discourse that was going to really change the practice for the better.
And I heard actually that people were starting to take up technology in their communities. Now, use of technology is a practice. And it's always worth remembering, I think, with technology that it's a practice. Once you start introducing technology, that will also affect the composition of your community and the domain. So bringing in new technology is not simply how do we use this technology or what is the best technology. Each introduction of new technology will allow new voices at the table. You know, other voices will come, voices who couldn't speak before. Or people who are good at technology suddenly have a louder voice than those who aren't. So there are a whole bunch of issues that come with the introduction of a new practice, including technology, which is around people and relationships and your domain.
Another difference between a community of practice and a team is that a community of practice is really a living entity that evolves over time. And it's a bit more like a relationship or a couple than a team, in the sense that when you first start, there is a kind of almost like a dating process, so a kind of uncertainty. Are we really a community? You know, do we really feel something really meaningful when we are together? And there is this uncertainty. And if you go to a first date, you don't necessarily come with a life plan, right? You want to get to the first kiss and leave with the idea that maybe we should meet again, right? That would be a successful first date. And communities of practice are more like that than a big work plan and we're going to do all that. Because if you go to a first date with a big life plan, the person will go, I don't know, I'm not ready for that, you know? But I'm ready to have another date, you know? So there is something living and evolving about a community of practice. And if you think of the life cycle of a couple, there is a lot that happens before you have the commitment of a mature couple, or maybe you get married or something. So you want to first see the potential, then exploring what happens when we are together, what kind of things are meaningful to do together, all the way to maturing. Then perhaps taking on a job like having kids, right? You don't want to have kids too early, you know, because you want the relationship to be solid. In the same way that, you know, you don't want to give a community a big job before they have really found that commitment to each other, like building a database of best practices or something like this. Yeah. And then what keeps the couple together is not necessarily what brought them together in the first place. So even a reflection on who are we as a community? Does it still work? And maybe at some point, a community may decide we're done, you know? We become a network, or we are transformed into, or on the contrary, we become a formal part of the organization. That's sometimes something that we have seen in businesses, that a community becomes so important that it has to have a budget, it has to become a business unit of its own. So there are different ways that a community moves on into a different form.
And in the same way as with relationships, you know, sometimes what you're not expecting is the thing that works. That's the same with community of practice. People often say, but, you know, what can we do to guarantee that this is going to work? It's the same as a relationship. You know, you don't know. You might do everything perfectly and it still doesn't work. And
could you say a little bit more about giving the community practice a big job too soon? I've seen some communities that actually have come together because they had a big job they had to get to work on.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that everything we say has been wrong once at least, okay? So because if there was a recipe for a community of practice, we would have written it and we could retire, you know? And there's no recipe. So it's exactly with marriage. You know, in some culture, a marriage is an organized thing. You don't date, you know? Your parents do the dating for you. And it's not necessarily worse than what we have in the West, right? In terms of longevity of marriages and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's that diverse. And so what brings people together can be very, very different things, and it could be a big job. So,
but actually also, I mean, what you're saying is, because sometimes what you see is a big job happening, and then communities of practice develop out of that, because people had to come together around a big job. Yeah. So they discover themselves through this big job. But we have seen many communities where often the convener or the sponsor or the organization has come in and said, well, you know, people in a community of practice need to do something. You know, we've got this big job to do, and that doesn't work. So it's more like a sort of cautionary tale that way round. Yeah. And which actually can work too, if somebody comes in, we've got a big job, you know, please take it on. But for the most part, there is this process of discovery first that needs to happen.
and for the most part, in most organizations, belonging to a committee of practice is a voluntary thing. It's not a checkbox that you know, oh, I've done my committee of practice. It's something that you choose to do, and the degree to which you are involved in the committee of practice is also something that you decide depending on the value that you get. So that's why also you have to be gentle with that, not to say, okay, well, while you are volunteering, why don't you collect data for quality control, which is an example I've seen in a company. They were killing their communities by asking them to report on quality control. So, a committee has to fit in the rhythm of the profession or the practice. And for you, I don't know how that works in terms of, well, you seem to have an annual meeting, so maybe something happens at your annual meeting, and then people go away. Maybe they have regional meetings. Maybe they have a teleconference or a video conference from time to time, or maybe they have a discussion board on which people can ask questions. And however the community can fit in your practice is an important part of making it sustainable. If there is too much, you know, the community takes too much, then people say, oh, I don't have time for this. You know? If the community is too slow, then people say, no, there's not much happening here. I don't know why I keep participating. So to find that right middle between too much and too slow is part of the art of cultivation.
Which is different for different communities. We've seen very successful communities of practice who meet every other year, for example. But they still every other year, everybody shows up, everyone talks about what they did with what they got from the last meeting and how it worked out and what has been the result, and then renew their friendship and their connections and decide what they want to try and achieve moving on to the next one. And that rhythm works for them. We've seen others who every week on the phone, some kind of telephone conference or something, and that works for them. So there is no one ideal, but what is important is that it works for people and that it's a rhythm, right? Every week, every month, every year and a half. So a rhythm and continuity is more important than how often you do it.
So let's look at some activities that communities get involved in. Well, we have pictures that are face-to-face because it's easier to have pictures, but most of these activities have an online version as well. So this is what we call a case clinic, and actually we're going to do that after the break today. So these people, here is a researcher here, and she's bringing a problem of how to do participative research in a third world country. And everybody else is helping her. Actually, you don't see that, but there is here a person on the phone from Washington, D.C. This is in South Africa. And so for her, the value of the community is that she had a challenge she was really struggling with. And then in a course of about an hour and a half, really, she got the value of the brain of a whole bunch of people who could understand what she was trying to do. So, and so we're actually going to use this format this afternoon. We call it a fishbowl, where you have an inner circle of people who talk and an outer circle of people who listen. But anybody from the outer circle can come in and replace someone from the inner circle to continue the conversation. So it's a way to have an intimate conversation with a large number of people. How many people were there that day? Probably 100 or something?
120, yeah.
120, yeah. So we had 120 people, but 6 of them were talking at a time. So you have a continuous, very intimate conversation, but everybody who is listening has a chance to come in and join. So that's a useful community activity.
Actually, one of the reasons why we like showing these slides of what communities do is because, again, going back to how we often think of learning, if we think of learning as going from somebody who knows to somebody who doesn't know, then you're stuck in a community of practice of thinking that you need to bring in some outside expert or somebody who knows to share with the people who don't know. Right? But actually, once you're in a community of practice, what you're dealing with much more is uncertainty. The learning is driven by uncertainty, not by certainty, not by knowing, but by not knowing. So the people who drive the learning are those people who don't know, not the people who know, which is a turnover. So when we talk about the case clinic, somebody has a problem. They don't know how to deal with it. They want to tap the brains of everybody else. So a case clinic happens. A case clinic is led by somebody who has a challenge and doesn't know what to do. And then other people share their experience. They share their advice about what worked or what didn't work in their context. And then the person who is giving the case clinic comes away with some clearer idea, some advice which they can take or they cannot take. Okay? But you can see that in a case clinic, the learning is driven by what's not known, not by what is known.
And I think that it's important to note that this valuation of uncertainty, this recognition that uncertainty is actually what drives the learning, is for everybody. And I'm sure that in pastoral education, it's like any practice. The practice itself is hard. There may be some people who are good and some people who are less good. But nobody goes in and says, oh, yeah, I know how to do it. You know what I mean? in practice, there is no expert who sails through. Because practice is always hard. To be in practice is always to function on the condition of uncertainty. You know, we think of knowing as certainty, but knowing in practice is always making productive decisions on the conditions of uncertainty. You are never sure that what you are doing with this kid is actually going to transform them, is actually going to give them a good life. But under this condition of uncertainty, if you're good, you can say things that are useful, you can develop an interaction that is productive, and so you live under this condition of uncertainty, and you are an expert at handling uncertainty. So it's a different way of thinking about knowledge than the traditional way of thinking about knowledge with certainty. And it is true that in science, because science has influenced our view of knowledge, it is true that in science, the more certain you are, the better your knowledge. And good for them. I mean, good for that way of thinking about knowledge is actually very good. It's what allows us to, you know, be in a room that's not going to crumble on us, because there are people who have some certainty that if you build it in concrete like this, it's not going to crumble. So there's great value to this perspective on knowledge, but we should not think this is the only way to know. There are other ways to know, and this ability to engage with uncertainty is a form of knowing, you know, that is very deep, because it allows us to face complex situations in a way that is productive. And certainly pastoral education is a complex thing, because it has all the complexity of the human experience.
So I've got several things, but I've been sitting here digesting a lot of what you've said. I am a humanist chaplain in the CEC route of things, and as you are, you know, earlier you spoke of the multiplicity of voices sort of important in a community of practice, and also the not needing an expert in the community of practice. Part of my struggle as being the only humanist in this group is that at times people are telling me how to be a chaplain to non-theists while being theistic themselves. And so I must bring in my own expertise as a non-theist to say, well, that's not really great practice. So I'm struggling with that. How do you make the multiplicity of voices without inviting experts in to help guide the process?
Well,
does that make sense?
No. When we say multiplicity of voices, you still have, for a working community of practice, you still have to have enough commonality that people can recognize the value of each other's uncertainty as a productive. So it's a good community of practice is a kind of interesting balance between diversity and homogeneity. If you have too much homogeneity, what you get is groupthink, and that's a disease of a community. If you have too much diversity, you have, why am I listening to this person? What this person is saying is totally irrelevant to me. So a good community of practice is a real balancing act between enough diversity that you actually have contestability and enough homogeneity that you have relevance. So whether you are a total outsider in this group and what people tell you is irrelevant, I think that would suggest maybe that your community of practice is actually not in here, but that your actual colleagues are somewhere else, which doesn't mean you don't belong to this association. It just means that for your practice, the real partner maybe are more in psychology than in here, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just talking off the top of my head, totally, because I don't know your practice well enough.
I appreciate that. I mean, in one sense, I would say this is a community of practice for me. I mean, that's partly why I'm here, in that I value individual spirituality and the process of making meaning, as you've spoken before, and helping people of a variety of traditions get there. What is not the community aspect for me are experiences where diversity of perspective is spoken as being valued, but in the actual practice in the community, it is not.
Well, then I would put some onus on you then
Yeah.
to make that discussable. If you belong to a community and your voice is not heard or is not recognized as part of the community, in a well-functioning community, this becomes discussable. And we will talk later about the way that we encourage this kind of leadership. But managing the voices is the work of a community.
Okay, I would totally agree, and that's partly why I'm even up here asking this question, is to, and those people who are in various communities of practice know that I do this often, but, and they might be tired of hearing me talk about it, but so, I agree with that the onus is in part on me, but at the same time, I reflect on an experience where I was on a panel for multi-faith chaplaincy and education, what that would look like. And the end of that conference, I got really great feedback, and people were saying they were very open to what I had to say and were curious. And then they ended with this big, round, Christian-centered prayer, then a laying on of the hands of everybody, to which was completely alienating to me, and I think to other Christians from traditions that did not have the laying on of hands, and of other non-Christians in the group for whom laying on of hands were just foreign. It's this practice of saying, yes, we value your opinion, but now you must transform into what we want you to be.
Yeah, and to me, that's a dysfunction for a community. Now, there is nothing that says that the community is always productive and always functional. There are as many dysfunctional communities as there are dysfunctional families, and that's a lot, okay? So the art of developing a good community of practice is really an art, it's actually difficult, because there are so many diseases, So groupthink is one disease, sort of like conflict, total conflict is one disease. Domination by some voices is a disease. So you always have to watch out, is our community silencing some voices, That's really important, not because we want to be nice to each other. We're not talking about a moral issue here of equality, no. It's just that when a voice is being silenced, the community is losing. The learning capability of the community is decreased. So this idea that you have to involve all voices is a learning capability discipline, not a moral discipline or a democratic discipline. A community of practice is not a democracy, it's a learning partnership. But what our observation is that groupthink is always threatening, and so you have really to watch out. Is there a level of agreement here that makes us blind to other possible voices? At the same time, do we let one slightly outsider totally disrupt what we're trying to do? So maybe, there's a bit of a tension there between including you and having you totally always throw off the learning of the group because you want to take it in a direction that nobody else wants to. See what I mean? I mean, it's a delicate thing. It's really a delicate thing.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I try to be respectful of the boundaries of those tensions. My theorist is Simone de Beauvoir and the ambiguity of existentialism. So tension is what I love. But yeah, at some point, you know, creating the space for the dissenting voice, I'm triangulating you as a conversation with the larger ACPE community, and I appreciate you letting me do that.
Well, we have, I should say, we have a slide that's coming up, but just in case we don't have time to show it, one of the things that we do have, when we work with communities, we have people in different, what we call leadership groups, and one of those leadership groups is called what we call community keepers. So each group is paying attention to one part of the process of the community.
Can we have the slide there? Yeah.
Right? And the community keepers, their job is to pay attention to voices. Right? So their job is, as them, to pay attention to those voices, to note where it's working or not, to live that tension, to discuss it among themselves, and to say, and to make recommendations to the group. So if we were working with you, we'd say, take that to the community keepers, and then it would be something that would be discussable with the community keepers. The main discussion would take place there, so that you didn't feel like you always had to bring it up with the whole group.
Yes, well, I appreciate that. And lest I be accused of hijacking the rest of this conversation, I will sit down. Thank you.
Well, it's a good segue. Actually, it's a good segue into our leadership group slide. Right? So the community keepers are one of those groups. So these, in fact, what this is we noticed that in mature, highly productive, functional communities of practice, they tend to pay attention to certain dimensions of the community working, one of which is voices. So we assign in communities, or people go to one of these roles. Community keepers is one. Another is what we call the agenda activists. The agenda activists are those people who are paying attention to what are we paying attention to? Are we paying attention to the themes and the things that are really going to help make a difference? So this is like our learning agenda. What are the challenges that people have when we come together? Are we really dealing with those, or are we going off track? So they reflect on that.
Then we have some groups that look at, the social reporters are a group that looks at how do we build a memory of our community? How do we capture memorable moments, maybe with a photo or with something like this? How do we capture important insights that come out of our conversation? How do we make, if there's a long conversation, in many communities, what these people will do is that there's a lot of conversation, they do a little summary of the conversation when it's concluded, so that somebody who is interested in the topic then can go and look at in the frequently asked questions. There's a little summary of the conversation. We call them social reporters. External messengers, they do the same thing, but they think of external audiences. So in our community, who is not in our community who needs to hear about what happened at that meeting? So that would be their function.
And we have critical friends. Critical friends are thinking of the process. Are we doing the right kind of activities? Are the lunch breaks long enough, etc.? Right? And we have technology stewards. Are we making the best of technology here? Who else needs to be brought up to speed? Should we try something else? You know.
The value detectives look at is our community really creating value? Are we merely making a difference? So, but the main idea here, and I saw someone taking a picture. We can share those slides perhaps with you, Barbara, and then you can make them available. Yeah.
So, who has the microphone? I think somebody took my microphone. Oh, you've got it. There's somebody behind you, I think, who wants it. Unless you were going to speak, yeah. But we would, I mean, just in practical terms, at the beginning of a community meeting, or actually, sometimes people even use it in conferences. So in a day conference or a 2-day conference, everybody, and then you get a little sticker which says, you know, on your name badge, it would say social reporter, right? So, or community keeper. So your job would be to pay attention to that during the meeting. There would be time, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, maybe 15 minutes, depending on the agenda, for all the people who belong to the same leadership group to come together, discuss their impressions, say what they want to say, And if, for example, if you don't belong to the community of keepers, but you have something to say to them, you would go and you would tell them, and they would put that in the discussion, and then you would have report out from each leadership group on the 2 days and what recommendations they would have going forward.
And so, you know, in a well-functioning communities, these are sort of naturally attended to. But what a little technique we have developed is to create those groups, sometimes completely at random, you know. People count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you join one group. Sometimes we let people self-select or something like that. But we've noticed that we can accelerate the process of a sense of ownership of the community by assigning people one of those roles and legitimizing things like, you know, people think, oh, you know, we need a break. Why don't we have a break? You think that, but you don't voice that. But if you have the role, then we expect you to voice it. Yeah. You know what I mean? So issues of voices, you know, we expect the community keepers to make the issue of voices discussable because it's their role.
Yeah, about a few months ago, we were in a meeting in Southeast Asia, and there was somebody who stood up to say something, and the rest of the community got a little bit defensive, or other people saying no, because it was quite an aggressive thing to say. And then one of the community keepers just stood up and said, look, I want to pause here, and I want us all to reflect. Right? Are we being defensive here, or are we really open to listening to things? And that was his job. So he was able to do that, you know, on behalf of the community.
Yeah, and he didn't feel like he was a complainer or anything, because that was his role. It was assigned to him as an official role in the community. And so he stood up and he says, as a community keeper, he kind of assumed legitimacy for what he was going to say because it was a role that he had. Yeah.
So we've got a question over there.
This gives me a place to ask something I've been thinking about, not applied as Steve was doing over here to our student groups and supervision there, but applied to us, ACPE, becoming an organization of communities of practice. One of my questions as now, fortunately, I guess, an older member in the group, is what happens to those with the different levels of practice that we already have. So you're giving me a place to think about that. Let me use the question master. I would bet that some of us, including me, in the room, we already have some mastership about some things. That's how it feels. I want to be in a community of practice that's meaningful, so I can make that choice. But I bring a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a desire to still learn. So how does the dynamic of somebody bringing experience and knowledge, is this how you start to reframe a role or who I am as a person in the group?
Actually, that's quite interesting. We don't have a role for elders, for example.
Oh, thank you.
But it would be, it might be one to think about as an elder. But also, we should be a little cautious here, because when we say, and also somebody else said something about experts, when we don't say experts or experience doesn't count, all right? We're not saying that everybody has to not know, right? Expertise, for example, I'll start with expertise. Expertise does count, but it's expertise that is pulled in by members, right? Pulled in. We have a particular, we've been working on this and we just don't know where to go any further. Let's bring in somebody else who has more experience than us. Let's bring in an expert to help us think about this problem. And so the learning is driven by people's not knowing, again. It's not driven by somebody who knows, the expert, or somebody who says, well, I've already got most of the answers, guys, so, you know, let me start this meeting and tell you all that you need to know. Here's my PowerPoint. So expertise is pulled in. And experience also. Experience fully matters in a community of practice. You should never, if you're in a community of practice, you never say, oh, well, I'll keep my mouth shut because everybody's got to find this out themselves. You can come in and say, well, look, I've had 20 years experience, right? And this is what has worked for me, and this is what hasn't worked. And I can tell you guys, you know, I've seen, you can say what you like. You never have to be not yourself. And if you are a person who has 20 years experience, you have 20 years experience, that is you.
On your slide, there's one point about community keepers and social experience, or dynamics, social dynamics. And it seems like this issue is a part of that, around how do you respect the knowledge of elders and what do they contribute to the ongoing relationship to the community. Is that correct from your perspective?
Yeah, actually, part of the voices, part of the discipline of voice in a community of practice is to say how each voice contributes to making the whole bigger than the sum of the parts, you know? And so, yes, there is a huge place in a community of practice for someone who has mastery of the practice, a huge place. That doesn't mean they are the only voice, you see? But it's like what Bev was saying. If practice is hard enough, then we need everybody's voice. And if you have 20 years of experience guiding kids towards a spiritual experience, we need to know, we need to hear everything that you've done. We want to milk your brain for everything that it has, because it's a hard job, you know? But it's not saying that there is a way to describe this knowledge that makes application unproblematic. You see what I mean? That's where a community of practice is different from a book, you know? A book says, hey, here is how to do this, go out and do it. If the book is well written enough, I mean, it depends what the book is about, especially. But if it's about an algorithm, if the recipe is described well enough, the doing should be unproblematic. That's one way of viewing knowledge. We don't view knowledge that way. Application is always problematic. And for you as a master, I'm sure that sometimes you look at a kid and you go, wow. You know what I mean? Because practice is hard, you know? And so a community of practice lives in that learning universe between people who have a lot of experience, people who have less experience, people who have a lot of experience but in different contexts, people who have a lot of experience but don't agree on certain things. A community of practice is a way to leverage the richness of that set of experience.
And actually, your question, I think, also asks a question about the role of the leader of the community or the coordinator of the community. Because when there is somebody who has got a lot of experience, actually, masters very often don't like going to all community meetings because they feel like they're repeating stuff they've heard before. But the role then of the facilitator or the coordinator is to really have an ear to the ground, and if they know that something's coming up, to contact the master or the person with the experience and say, this discussion is, coming to the fore again. Would you come? Would you please make sure you're here? Or if it's an online discussion, which the master doesn't want to keep up with every single online discussion because they've had that discussion 20 times before, right? But if the coordinator or the facilitator can just phone them up and say, look, there's a discussion going on here, and your expertise or your experience would be wonderful. Please do come in. So your question, I think, says something about the role of the coordinator. We haven't got much time. We've got at least 2 more questions, so we should, yeah.
I'm curious about the leadership groups, and it kind of reminds me of in the old days we would say have a secretary and no one wants to be the secretary. Mm-hmm. And I just have a question about these roles, critical friends and community keepers, I'm wondering about, it seems like they overlap. So I'm wondering about how you distinguish those two roles.
Well, actually, they do often overlap, and often we put them all as one, I should say. Okay? But sometimes, especially if a community has a very complex set of activities and things going on, we'd separate them. One, to pay attention to voices, because voices is both the voices in the room, as we've talked about, but voices is also a bigger thing in the sense of who's not at the table who should be. Who are the people who we should be inviting but who are not here? How do we reach out to them? Right? So there's a much bigger thing for the community keepers to do. So if it's a big and complex community, we would separate them, but otherwise, you're right, we often put them together.
And often in communities that don't use that technique, you have one person who is kind of a committee leader who pays attention to all of that. So depending on the community, on the size of the community, we divide those groups, or we merge them in a way that's meaningful. But by the way, thinking about the secretary, so when we do that, we assign everybody to one of these groups. You know, so you don't have a choice. You belong to one, and it's making community leadership more like a game. You know, more like something we do. You know, and it gives legitimacy in a way that you can be critical, or you can be you can complain about the committee doing something without being seen as a complainer, because it's your role.
As another aging member who wants to remain generative, what Deborah's question prompted was this wondering as I look at your chart, and 2 key points. In a sense, we are external messengers we're not the external messengers, but we could be stakeholders because we have a stake in the ongoing life of this organization that we are still investing ourselves in. And in a sense, we're a part of that community of memory. So I think we are on the chart. So that's one point. I think the other point that you've raised is that that community of practice has people who come and go. So what's to say we can't come if we see a concern? So it encourages me to stay generative, that I can always come back. So is that consistent with what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely.
And this idea of having a stake in the continuity of a practice is really beautiful. You know what I mean? It's really like, wow, this is something valuable. And that's where, you know, one of the beautiful things in a community of practice, and it even happens in business, but especially in a group like yours, is the sense of legacy and the sense of wanting to include newcomers. There's a kind of generosity that comes with mastery when you feel like I'm not a young wolf in here for myself. I can welcome newcomers. I want newcomers to become good at this practice. So there are a lot of beautiful dimensions here at a human level of learning, because learning is always viewed as part of the experience of being human, not simply knowledge, you know.
And I like the idea of elders being part of external messengers, because actually elders often have gained legitimacy also outside in different fields. And so they are a great broker or a conduit to the outside world, which often, when you're new in a community of practice, you don't realize how important that is. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I see the arrows going in for critical friends, community keepers, those sorts of things. That makes sense to me. I'm wondering if you could say more about the value detectives and the arrow going out. On one level, I think of, you know, working in a group, we say we raise up the values to the community itself, but the arrow going out evokes my curiosity.
Well, actually, I think we've made a mistake. I think it should go in and out. Now you mention it, because where we're talking about value, it doesn't like that. Where we're talking about value, We're talking about the value that is created by the community, how it changes people's practice, and what effect that has on the world, right? So if I learn something in my community through what I do with my community, and it changes what I do when I'm not in my community, and it affects the world, right? That is the value. But you're absolutely, so you need to monitor that to show what is the value of coming together. The value of coming together is it has a change in the world, right? But it's also important to bring that back into the community, because that's how people will learn. Ah, you changed your practice like that, and that's what it did to the world? Whoa, maybe I should try that too. So it goes out and in, out and in. So thank you.
I have a question about just understanding the way the optimal communities of practice. Do they function better when they're focused on a process or on a sort of a topic? And the question comes out of the gentleman talking about being the only humanist. It reminds me of the phases of our own history where women were invited in. It was all white male Protestant men, white male men. And women were invited in, but to some degree only if they would act like the men. I mean, to put it somewhat crudely. And then we got some racial diversity, but again, only if you sort of would do it the way the white people did it. And then some non-Christians, but only if you would do it. So it reminds me very much of that, and I'm wondering if the focus of a community of practice would be in being the current outsider, rather than the specificity of what makes them an outsider be the topic. Is my question making sense? That there's some way that the process of hearing the other voice is more important than the particular nature of the difference. Maybe that's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to a very important topic for an organization like yours, which is the art of domains. What are the right domains? Like, so for instance, if you had the choice of, should we have a community of practice for women chaplains or not? To me, that's a very important question. And the answer is not immediate. I don't know the answer. I cannot tell you from the answer. But it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, there may be a specific practice of being a woman chaplain or a woman pastoral educator, because of the way you're looked at, because of the way you are treated in the organization. There are all sorts of practice you have to develop to act as a woman in that. At the same time, it may create a separation that is reproducing the very separation you want to bridge. Okay, so so again, a community of practice is not necessarily a forever thing. So you may, like for instance, in an automotive company, they had the Japanese didn't want to be part of the community because they felt the Americans and the Europeans were always talking on the phone, and they were always silent. So they started their own community, the Japanese engineers, right? But after a year, they decided, okay, now we feel we can join the bigger community. So again, the art of domain to transform ACPE into a set of relevant domain is a dynamic art. Okay, these two communities should merge. This community should divide. Really, there are two different practices here. So the art of sustaining something like ACPE as a system of communities is really a set of questions, just the one you brought up, that you may want actually to have a little subcommittee that would be, and maybe that's the well-being committee that's doing it, to think through, do we have the right set of domains? Which is something that you do if you are a business organization. You have to ask yourself the question, if we want to be successful 5 years from now, do we have the right set of capabilities being built by our practitioners? So this sense of translating a business like designing computers into a set of capabilities that need to be sustained by the right people is the art of what is called knowledge management or whatever. Yeah.
But also, I want to add to that, because Etienne was talking very much about thinking about it, which is which is important, but there's another one which is also, if you had a community of practice, for example, of women chaplains, would people show up? Right? Are there enough people for whom it is important? You can think about it and say, it is important, we'll have one, but if nobody's there giving their passion and their energy for it because it's not important enough to their practice, it shouldn't exist. There's no should exist or shouldn't exist. If people's feet are there, if their bottoms are on the chairs, it's important. Yeah.
My name's Susan Gullickson, but as a social reporter and a value detective, I guess I'd like to claim for ACPE, we have done these sorts of communities of practice along the way. We've had women's caucuses, we've had, racial and ethnic minority groupings, we've had groups that needed to come together to support one another and develop our competencies and develop our ways of interacting with the larger group and remained involved with the larger group. I think, and we've had women's lunches at these national conferences, and I know we haven't had them for a year or two, and I think that's because we don't need that as much now. And so, I'm just wanting to claim for us, yes, we have naturally done some of these things, and I'm embracing the way that you were describing it and outlining it up here. It helps me give some words to some of the things we've been doing. And
Yeah, so communities of practice have been with humankind since we were in caves discussing the chase of the bear that didn't work. So it's not something new, But I think, at least in the organization that we've worked with, bringing in the vocabulary and bringing in the attention to what really develops learning capability in these groups has added a dimension to simply, let's have a women's caucus. It's more like, what should happen when these women are together to develop the practice? And not simply, oh, we are birds of the same feather. Yeah.
Do we have a timekeeper here, or are we supposed to keep the time ourselves, which we're not very good at? Yeah.
Was I the timekeeper? I didn't know.
Well, either that or you need to give it to us. I can. It's ours. So it's already 10:05.
I think this,
Two more
this
questions?
person has been waiting for a number.
The comment I have has to do with elder and uncertainty, and I represent part of the elder class. And I would say that as I consider this perspective, that I stand, even with experience, with a huge amount of uncertainty about what the future will be for us. And I look to the folks who walked across the stage last night as the expert and expect that they have as much or more of a stake in this association as I do at this point. And so I would just raise up that part of my challenge to those of us in the class I'm in is that we may not need to spend a lot of energy being guardians of the universe. But we may want to be more open to how we can learn and be embraced by a millennial who is on fire for what we have created.
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you one thing. I will tell you one thing.
Etienne, put that down, please.
Oh, yeah, I will tell you one thing. That millennium probably cares about your uncertainty more than about your certainties. For me to suddenly realize that the people I looked up as experts actually live in a world of uncertainty was so comforting and so inspiring. Oh, I'm not the only one in that state of uncertainty. The masters live in uncertainty too. They just have learned to live with it better than I. Yeah, that's really a learning partnership then that is valuable.
So we have the last question.
Perhaps when we come back from break, you could talk about this. What I'm wondering is, could you talk a little bit about this process in the context of a rigid hierarchical organization? Obviously, I'm in a rigid and hierarchical organization, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that in that context.
Do you have a case? Are you part of a case clinic later? No.
But I'll tell you one thing, okay?
Yeah.
the best online community we have ever seen is in the US Army. Okay? Cool. So now it's dead because the hierarchy actually did end up killing it. But for when it for when it was alive, it was called company commanders, and it was a community of practice on that function of a company commander, where you move from just being a leading soldier to actually being in charge of a whole company with a big budget and also. And it's a very difficult transition in your career in the military. And so these two company commanders decided, they had written a little book, and they decided to create a community of practice. And it grew to about 5,000 members. And it was an interesting community because you belonged to it for 2 years. So you belonged to it before, then you're a full member for 2 years, and then you were an alumnus of that community for as long as you wanted, right? And it functioned very, very well because it was such a difficult thing for those soldiers to become managers. And it was really a beautifully facilitated online community where people would discuss. One of the most interesting discussions that we saw on that community was a person who, one of the soldiers was killed. I think he was in Iraq, and she had to write to the parents, and she was totally frightened of having to do that. And it was beautiful to see how the community came around her, helped her draft the letter, and really a beautiful sense of learning. So I think that the hierarchy does not matter so much. It did end up mattering because, well, we can tell you the story.
But also they wrote a book called Company Command. So if you go on Amazon, you can get it. So it's interesting to read.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, what matters is more than anything for an organization, whether it's hierarchical or flat, is do you value the knowledge of the practitioner? You know? And I think that in the Army, what you have is that you may be a general, but you know that the soldier knowledge is important. You see what I mean? Yeah. You don't think that you know better, that you know everything. So in that sense, respecting the knowledge of practitioners is more important than whether the organization is hierarchical or not.
Okay.
Very good.